Perhaps she won't be there, said Michael. Yes, she will, said Jane. She's always there forever and ever. They were walking up Ludgate Hill on the way to pay a visit to Mr. Banks in the city. For he had said that morning to Mrs. Banks, My dear, if it doesn't rain, I think Jane and Michael might call for me at the office today. That is, if you're agreeable. I have a feeling I should like to be taken out to tea and shortbread fingers. If it's not, and it's not too often I have a treat. So Mrs. Banks has invited his kids to come have tea with him in the middle of the day. And Mrs. Banks said she would think about it. But all day long, though Jane and Michael had watched her anxiously, she had not seemed to be thinking about it at all. From the things she said, she was thinking about the laundry bill and Michael's new overcoat. And where was Aunt Flossie's address? And why did that wretched Mrs. Jackson ask her to tea on a second Thursday of the month when she knew that was the very day Mrs. Banks had to go to the dentist's? Now you see this picture here. That's a blue overcoat, just like the one Michael had, that blue coat. Suddenly, when they felt quite sure she would never think about Mr. Banks's treat, she said, Now, children, don't stand staring at me like that. Get your things on. You are going to the city to have tea with your father. Have you forgotten? And as if they could have forgotten, for it was not as though it were the only tea. For it was not as though it were only the tea that mattered. There was also the bird woman, and she herself was the best of all treats. That is why they were walking up Ludgate Hill and feeling very excited. Mary Poppins walked between them, wearing her new hat and looking very distinguished. Every now and then she would look into the shop window just to make sure the hat was still there, and that the pink roses on it had not turned into common flowers like marigolds. You see that hat down there in the corner? It has some pink roses around it, and the orange flowers beside, those are called marigolds. They are just a common flower. They're not expensive. They're not fancy, and actually they don't smell very good. Marigolds, they don't. So Mary Poppins loves to look at her own hat in the window to see that it looks so beautiful and just to check her roses looking so fancy and expensive and lovely. Every time she stopped to make sure, Jane and Michael would sigh. But they did not dare say anything for fear that she would spend even longer looking at herself in the windows and turning this way and that to see which attitude was the most becoming. Mary Poppins really likes to look at herself. But at last they came to St. Paul's Cathedral, which was built a long time ago by a man with a bird's name. You see, there's the picture of that place with all the birds flying around. That's St. Paul's Cathedral. This is just a drawing, but I'm going to show you a real photo of it later. Wren it was, but no relation to Jenny. That is why so many birds live near Sir Christopher Wren's Cathedral, which also belongs to St. Paul, and that is why the bird woman lives there too. There she is, cried Michael suddenly, and he danced on his toes with excitement. Don't point, said Mary Poppins, giving a last glance at the pink roses in the window of a carpet shop. She's saying it, she's saying it, cried Jane, holding tight to herself for fear she would break in two with delight. And she was saying it. The bird woman was there and she was saying it. Feed the birds, tuppence a bag. Feed the birds, tuppence a bag. Feed the birds, feed the birds, feed the birds, tuppence a bag. Now, I don't know if you remember this, friends, but tuppence means 2 pence, and 2 pence means 2 coins, and 2 coins is her price. This woman is selling is selling breadcrumbs in a bag. You see, I have a picture of the breadcrumbs, which is just, you take a piece of bread and you make it become just little tiny bits. And you break it into little tiny bits. And then it's very cheap. So she's selling it for 2 pennies. Sorry, I said pence, 2 pennies, which are those 2 coins in the corner there. This woman's just sitting there saying, feed the birds, 2pence a bag. Feed the birds, 2pence a bag. Over and over again, the same thing in a high chanting voice that made the words seem like a song. And as she said it, she held out little bags of breadcrumbs to the passers-by. All around her flew the birds, circling and leaping and swooping and rising. Mary Poppins always called them sparrows because, she said conceitedly, all birds were alike to her. But Jane and Michael knew that they were not sparrows. Now, if you look at my pictures, friends, this bird that I put on top, like above the bird lady, this one right here, that is a sparrow. It's a very type of small common bird. And the woman calls all the birds she sees sparrows, but the truth is they're not all sparrows. Jane and Michael knew that they were not sparrows, but doves and pigeons. There were fussy and chatty gray doves like grandmothers, and brown rough-voiced pigeons like uncles, and green cackly no I've got no money today pigeons like fathers. And the silly, anxious, soft blue doves were like mothers. That's what Jane and Michael thought anyway. They flew round and round the head of the bird woman as the children approached. And then, as though to tease her, they suddenly rushed away through the air and sat on the top of St. Paul's, laughing and turning their heads away and pretending they didn't know her. That's the birds, I mean, the birds we're talking about. The birds are all around her, flying and swooping, and then as soon as people come up, they fly away and sit on top of the building, that big building with the pointy top, right there in that picture, as I showed you before. It was Michael's turn to buy a bag. Jane had bought one last time. He walked up to the bird woman and held out 4 halfpennies. Feed the birds, 2pence a bag, said the bird woman, as she put a bag of crumbs into his hand and tucked the money away into the folds of her huge black skirt. Why don't you have penny bags? Said Michael. Then I could buy 2. Feed the birds, 2pence a bag, said the bird woman. And Michael knew it was no good asking her more questions. He and Jane had often tried, but all she could say, and all she had ever been able to say was, feed the birds, 2pence a bag, just as a cuckoo can only say, cuckoo, cuckoo, no matter what questions you ask him. Now, friends, I thought it might be interesting for us to actually get to meet the cuckoo bird because it does make that nice little sound. So I'm going to play you a little video of a cuckoo bird. This is just so you can learn about a bird and hear the sound that it makes, okay? So we'll just watch this little video of the cuckoo bird. All right, I'm going to skip ahead a bit to where it should be. Sorry, 1 second. Cuckoo, cuckoo. So that's what the cuckoo bird looks like. Now you can see it making the noise. Cuckoo, 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 cuckoo. And if you can imagine that this bird is a person, and you ask it a question, or if you can imagine that the birds can understand you and say, hello, how are you today? And it says, cuckoo. Say, what's your name? And it says, cuckoo. Say, how old are you? And it says, cuckoo. That's what Michael means, because this woman, this bird woman, you can ask her questions and try to chat with her, but all she ever says is, feed the birds, 2pence a bag, feed the birds, 2pence a bag. It's the same thing, always. Her answer every single time. Just like if you try to talk to this bird and all it can say is cuckoo, cuckoo. So, yeah. All right, let's keep reading. Jane and Michael and Mary Poppins spread the crumbs in a circle on the ground, and presently, one by one at first, and then in twos and threes, the birds came down from St. Paul's. Dainty David, said Mary Poppins with a sniff, as one bird picked up a crumb and dropped it again from its beak. But the other birds swarmed upon the food, pushing and scrambling and shouting. At last there wasn't a crumb left, for it's not really polite for a pigeon or a dove to leave anything on a plate. When they were quite certain that the meal was finished, the birds rose with one grand fluttering movement and flew round the bird woman's head, copying in their own language the words that she said. One of them sat on her hat and pretended he was a decoration for the crown. Another of them mistook Mary Poppins' new hat for a rose garden and pecked off a flower. It means that one bird came and took one of the flowers off of Mary Poppins' rose hat. "You sparrow!" cried Mary Poppins, and shook her umbrella at him. The pigeon, very offended, flew back at the bird woman, and to pay out Mary Poppins, stuck the rose in the ribbon of the bird woman's hat, which means that bird that had taken the flower out of Mary Poppins' hat, he went and put it in the hat of the bird woman. "You ought to be in a pie. That's where you ought to be," said Mary Poppins to him very angrily. Then she called to Jane and Michael. "Time to go," she said, and flung a parting glance of fury at the pigeon. But he only laughed and flicked his tail and turned his back on her. Now this is a picture of the real St. Paul's Cathedral in London, friends. "Goodbye," said Michael to the bird woman. "Feed the birds," she replied, smiling. "Goodbye," said Jane. "Tuppence a bag," said the bird woman, and waved her hand. Then they left her, walking on either side of Mary Poppins. "What happens when everybody goes away, like us?" said Michael to Jane. He knew quite well what happened, but it was the proper thing to ask Jane because the story was really hers. So Jane told him, and he added the bits she had forgotten. "At night, when everybody goes to bed," began Jane, "and the stars come out," added Michael. "Yes, even if they don't, all the birds come down from the top of St. Paul's and run very carefully all over the ground just to see that there are no crumbs left and to tidy it up for the morning. And when they have done that, you've forgotten the baths. Oh yes, the baths themselves. They bathe themselves and comb their wings with their claws. And when they have done that, they fly 3 times round the head of the bird woman, and then they settle. Do they sit on her shoulders? Yes, and on her hat. And on her basket with the bags in it? Yes, and some on her knee. And then she smooths down the head feathers of each one in turn and tells it to be a good bird. In the bird language? Yes. And when they are all sleepy and don't want to stay awake any longer, she spreads out her skirts, as a mother hen spreads out her wings, and the birds go creep, creep, creeping underneath. And as soon as the last one is under, she settles down over them, making little brooding, nesting noises, and they sleep there till morning. Michael sighed happily. He loved the story and was never tired of hearing it. "And it's all quite true, isn't it?" he said, just as he always did. "No," said Mary Poppins, who always said no. "Yes," said Jane, who always knew everything. So let's look again quickly at the picture of the bird woman. If you look carefully, you can actually see that there's birds sleeping all over her. Let me see if I can count them. She has a bird on her hat. She has a bird in her pocket. She has a bird nestled in this part of her skirt. Here's a bird under her skirt getting warm. There's one here. There's even one over here. And there's birds behind the hat also that she has under her skirt. But this woman, she just sits in the same place every day, and she sits with the birds, and they cuddle up to her even at night, according to the story that Jane was telling. Wow, that was a short chapter. Let's keep reading in chapter 8. Chapter 8 is called Mrs. Corey. 2 pounds of sausages, best pork, said Mary Poppins, and at once, please, we're in a hurry. The butcher, who wore a large blue and white striped apron, was a fat and friendly man. He was also large and red and rather like one of his sausages. He leant upon his chopping block and gazed admiringly at Mary Poppins. Then he winked pleasantly at Jane and Michael. Winking means like this, when you shut one eye, like this. I can't do it very well, but it's sort of just like it's like how to say hello somehow. Like, it's friendly. It's kind of friendly. In a hurry, he said to Mary Poppins. Well, it's a pity. I'd hoped you'd drop in for a bit of a chat. We butchers, you know, like a bit of company, and we don't often get the chance of talking to a nice, handsome young lady like you. Okay, the butcher is a man who works at the meat shop. And so he's not a very fancy person. And Mary Poppins took the kids in to buy some meat, and now this is the butcher talking to her. He broke off suddenly, for he had caught sight of Mary Poppins' face. The expression on it was awful. This is what her face looked like. You see my face? And the butcher found himself wishing there was a trap door in the floor of his shop that would open up and swallow him up. Oh, well, he said, blushing even redder than usual. If you're in a hurry, of course. 2 pounds, did you say? Best pork? Right you are. And he hurriedly hooked down a long string of the sausages that were festooned across the shop. He cut off a length about 3/4 of a yard, would sort it into a garland, and wrapped it up first in white and then brown paper. He pushed the parcel across the chopping block. Do you see the picture of these sausages, friends? This is what sausages look like. I know you all know this, but just in case you don't know the English word, it's made of pork. So juro sausages at the butcher shop. That's what they asked for. And the next, he said, hopefully, still blushing. He's feeling embarrassed because what he said about Mary Poppins is that she's very pretty and he wants her to stay and chat with him, but she does not want to stay and chat, and she's actually very upset that he's being like very friendly with her. She's not happy. So now he's feeling nervous and embarrassed. There will be no next, said Mary Poppins with a haughty sniff. And she took the sausages and turned the perambulator round very quickly and wheeled it out of the shop in such a way that the butcher knew he had mortally offended her. But he glanced at the window as she went so that she could see. But she glanced at the window as she went so she could see how her new shoes looked in the reflection. Look, I put a picture of the shoes on the slide. They were bright brown kid shoes with 2 buttons, very smart. Jane and Michael trailed after her, wondering when she would have come to the end of her shopping list. But because of the look on her face, they dared not ask her. Mary Poppins gazed up and down the street as though deep in thought, and then suddenly, making up her mind, she snapped, "Fishmonger!" and turned the perambulator in at the shop next to the butcher's. Now, the fishmonger is the person who sells the fish, okay? "1 Dover sole," and this is what she's saying to the man who works in the fish shop. 1 Dover sole, which is this one. It's this flat fish here. 1.5 pounds of halibut. This one is the halibut. 1 pint of prawns. These are prawns. We would call them xia prawns. And a lobster. Here's the lobster with the big Pinchers, that's the lobster, said Mary Poppins, talking so quickly that only somebody used to taking orders could possibly have understood her. The fishmonger, unlike the butcher, was a long, thin man, so thin that he seemed to have no front to him, but only two sides. He looked so sad that you felt he had either just been weeping or was just going to. Jane said that this was due to some secret sorrow that had haunted him since his youth. And Michael thought that the fishmonger's mother must have fed him entirely on bread and water when he was a baby, and that he had never forgotten about it. Anything else? Said the fishmonger hopelessly, in a voice that suggested he was quite sure there wouldn't be. Not today, said Mary Poppins. The fishmonger shook his head sadly and did not look at all surprised. He had known all along there would be nothing else. Sniffing gently, he tied up the parcel and dropped it into the perambulator. Bad weather, he observed, wiping his eye with one hand. Don't believe we're going to get any summer at all. Not that we ever did, of course. You don't look too blooming, he said to Mary Poppins. But then, nobody does. Mary Poppins tossed her head. So the butcher said that she looked pretty, and the fishmonger said she doesn't look too blooming, which I guess means she doesn't look too pretty. So now she was offended because she thought the first guy was rude for saying, oh, you look so pretty. And now the second man in the fishmonger shop said she doesn't look pretty, and now she thinks he's rude too. Speak for yourself, she said crossly, and flounced to the door, pushing the perambulator so fiercely that it bumped into a bag of oysters. The idea, Jane and Michael heard her say as she glanced down at her shoes, not looking too blooming in her new kid shoes with 2 buttons. The idea! That was what they heard her thinking. Outside on the pavement, she paused, looking at her list and ticking off what she had bought. Michael stood first on one leg and then on the other. Mary Poppins, are we never going home? He said crossly. Mary Poppins turned and regarded him with something with disgust. That, she said briefly, is as it may be. And Michael, watching her fold up her list, wished he had not spoken. You can go home if you like, she said haughtily. We are going to buy the gingerbread. Michael's face fell. If only he had managed to say nothing. He hadn't known that gingerbread was at the end of the list. That's your way, said Mary Poppins shortly, pointing in the direction of Cherry Tree Lane. If you don't get lost, as she added as an afterthought. So basically she's saying, oh, Michael, you're complaining about the shopping trip being so long. You want to go home? Fine. Walk home by yourself and don't get lost. Oh, no, Mary Poppins, please, no, I didn't mean it, really. Oh, Mary Poppins, please, cried Michael. Do let him come, Mary Poppins, said Jane. I'll push the perambulator if only you let him come. Mary Poppins sniffed. If it wasn't Friday, she said darkly to Michael, you'd go home in a wink. An absolute twink. She moved onwards, pushing John and Barbara. Jane and Michael knew that she had relented, and following, wondering what a twink was. Suddenly, Jane noticed that they were going in the wrong direction. But Mary Poppins, I thought you said gingerbread. This isn't the way to Green, Brown, and Johnson's where we always get it. She began and stopped because of Mary Poppins' face. She's making a serious face at Jane. Am I doing the shopping, or are you? Mary Poppins inquired. You, said Jane in a very small voice. Oh, really? I thought it was the other way around, said Mary Poppins with a scornful laugh. Ha! She gave the perambulator a little twist with her hand, and it turned a corner and drew up suddenly. Jane and Michael stopped abruptly behind it, found themselves outside the most curious shop they had ever seen. It was very small and dingy. Faded loops of colored paper hung in the windows, and on the shelves were very shabby little boxes of sherbet, old licorice sticks, and very withered, hard-looking apples on a stick. There was a small dark doorway between the windows, and through this Mary Poppins propelled the perambulator while Jane and Michael followed at her heels. Inside the shop, they could dimly see the glass-topped counter that ran on 3 sides of it. And in a case under the glass were rows and rows of dark, dry gingerbread, each slab so studded with gilt stars that the shop itself seemed to be faintly lit by them. Jane and Michael glanced around to find what kind of person was to serve them. Now, friends, if you look at these pictures, I put a picture of an old type of candy shop. It looks very old and plain, doesn't it? And so they're going into a candy shop, or it's a confectionery, which is a shop where you can buy sweet things, not just candy, but also ice cream or cakes and things. The gingerbread that they're wanting to buy, I couldn't find a picture of what that would really be, because when we have gingerbread now, we usually have something that would be like gingerbread cake or gingerbread cookies. Like you see those gingerbread men, they're cookies. But what they're going to buy is something else. But it's made of the same thing. It's made of that brown gingerbread, and it probably tastes similar too. Jane and Michael were very surprised when Mary Poppins called out, Fanny, Annie, where are you? Her voice seemed to echo back to them from each dark wall of the shop. And as she called, 2 of the largest people the children had ever seen rose from behind the counter and shook hands with Mary Poppins. The huge women that leaned down over the counter said, Howdy do, in voices as large as themselves, and shook hands with Jane and Michael. Howdy do, miss. Jane, oh wait, sorry, that's Michael talking. Howdy do, miss. Michael paused, wondering which of the ladies was which. Fanny's my name, said one of them. My rheumatism is about the same. Thank you for asking. She spoke very mournfully, as though she were unused to such a courteous greeting. I'm sorry. Yes. Okay, so I don't have pictures, but just imagine there are 2 really tall women, like as taller than me, definitely taller than me. Their names are Fanny and Annie. And when Mary Poppins calls out their names, they come and they're shaking hands with the kids. It's a lovely day, began Jane politely to the other sister, who kept Jane's hand imprisoned for almost a minute in her huge clasp. I'm Annie, she informed them miserably, and handsome is as handsome does. Jane and Michael thought that the sisters had a very odd way of expressing themselves, but they had not time to be surprised. For long, Miss Fanny and Miss Annie were reaching out their long arms to the perambulator. Each shook hands solemnly with one of the twins, who were so astonished that they began to cry. Now, what's this? What's this? A high, thin, crackly little voice came up from the back of the shop. At the sound of it, the expression on the faces of Miss Fanny and Miss Annie, sad before, became even sadder. They seemed frightened and ill at ease, and somehow Jane and Michael realized that the 2 huge sisters were wishing that they were smaller and less conspicuous. What's all this I hear? Cried the curious high little voice, coming nearer. And presently, round the corner of the glass, case the owner of it appeared. She was as small as her voice and so crackly. To the children, she seemed to be older than anything in the world. Her wispy hair and her stick-like legs, her wizened, wrinkly little face. But in spite of this, she ran toward them as lightly and as gaily as though she were still a little girl. Now, well, I do declare, bless me, if it isn't Mary Poppins, with Jane and Barbara Banks. What? Jane and Michael. Oh, sorry, with John and Barbara Banks. What, Jane and Michael too? Well, isn't this a nice surprise for me? I assure you I haven't been so surprised since Christopher Columbus discovered America. Truly, I haven't. She smiled delightedly as she came to greet them, and her feet made little dancing movements inside the tiny elastic-sided boots. She ran to the perambulator and rocked it gently, crooking her thin, twisted old fingers at John and Barbara until they stopped crying and began to laugh. That's better, she said, cackling gaily. And then she did a very odd thing. She broke off 2 of her fingers and gave each one to John and Barbara. The oddest part of it was that in the space left by the 2 broken off fingers, 2 new ones grew at once. Jane and Michael clearly saw it happen. Oh, barley sugar can't possibly hurt them, the old lady said to Mary Poppins. Okay, did you guys just hear that? This old woman, she broke off her fingers. What? That's so weird. That's so gross. So scary, right? But when she broke it off, she gave them to the babies, and 2 of her new fingers grew in, so she grew back 2 new fingers. But then she said that her fingers were made of sugar. What? She said the barley sugar was what her fingers were made of, and so when she gave the fingers to the little kids, she said, oh, it won't hurt them. They can eat it. It's just made of sugar. Oh, this is so weird. It's so weird. I don't understand. Why is this in the story? I mean, I'm just reading you what P.L. Travers wrote, but for me, I think it's kind of really weird. Oh, okay, well, maybe we're going to figure this out. I'm not sure. Let's keep reading. Anything you give them, Miss Corey, could only do them good, said Mary Poppins with the most surprising courtesy. What a pity, Michael couldn't help saying, that they weren't peppermint bars. Well, they are sometimes, said Miss Corey gleefully. And very good they taste too, and I often nibble on them myself if I can't sleep at night. Splendid for the digestion. Did you hear that? Miss Corey eats her own fingers when she can't sleep at night, when her fingers are made of peppermint candy. Oh, this is so weird. I know. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know why this is in the story. What will they be next time? Asked Jane, looking at Miss Corey's fingers with interest. Ah, said Miss Corey, that's just the question. I never know from day to day what they will be. I take the chance, my dear, as I heard William the Conqueror say to his mother when she advised him not to go conquering England. You must be very old, said Jane, sighing enviously and wondering if she would ever be able to remember what Miss Corey remembered. Mrs. Corey flung back her wispy little head and shrieked with laughter. Oh, she said, well, I'm quite a chicken compared to my grandmother. Now there's an old woman, if you like. Still, I go back a good way. I remember the time when they were making this world. Anyway, and I was well out of my teens then. My goodness, that was a to-do. I can tell you. She broke off suddenly, screwing up her little eyes at the children. But dearie me, here I am running on, and you've not been served. I suppose, my dear, she turned to Mary Poppins, whom she appeared to know very well. I suppose you've come for some gingerbread. That's right, Miss Corey, said Mary Poppins politely. Good. Have Fanny and Annie given you any? She looked at Jane and Michael as she said this. Jane shook her head. Two hushed voices came from behind the counter. No, Mother, said Miss Fanny meekly. We were just going to, Mother, began Miss Annie in a frightened whisper. At that, Miss Corey drew herself up to her full height and regarded her gigantic daughters furiously. She said in a soft, fierce, terrifying voice, just going to? Oh, indeed, that is very interesting. And who, may I ask, Annie, gave you permission to give away my gingerbread? Nobody, Mother. I didn't give it away. I only thought. You only thought. That is very kind of you, but I will thank you not to think. I can do all the thinking that is necessary here, said Miss Corey in her soft, terrible voice, and then she burst into a harsh cackle of laughter. Look at her. Just look at her. Coward custard, crybaby, she shrieked, pointing her naughty finger at her daughter. Jane and Michael turned and saw a large tear coursing down Miss Annie's huge face. But they did not say anything, for in spite of her tininess, Miss Corey made them feel rather small and frightened. But as soon as Mrs. Corey looked the other way, Jane seized the opportunity to offer Miss Annie her handkerchief. Now, do you see that white napkin thing in the corner of the screen? That's a handkerchief. And I told you before, that's the kind of thing that people hold on to if they need to blow their nose or cry or, have some little sweat. You keep it in your pocket in case you need something to dab your face with or clean your face with. So when they see Miss Annie, one of the daughters who's very tall, when they see her crying, Jane gives her a handkerchief. But as soon as the huge tear completely drenched it, and Miss Annie, with a grateful look, wrung it out before she returned it to Jane. And you, Fanny, do you think too, I wonder? The high little voice was now directed at the other daughter. No, Mother, said Fanny, trembling. Just as well for you. Open that case. With frightened, fumbling fingers, Mrs. Fanny opened the glass case. Now, my darlings, Mrs. Corey said in quite a different voice. She smiled and beckoned so sweetly to Jane and Michael that they were ashamed of having been frightened of her. She felt she must be very nice after all. Won't you come and take your pick, my lambs? It's a special recipe for today, one I got from Alfred the Great. He was a very good cook, I remember, though he did not once burn the cakes. How many? So Jane and Michael see this woman, this creepy little short woman who's super old. They see her yelling at her daughters, and then all of a sudden she's acting so sweet and gentle with them. Can you imagine how weird this would be? Jane and Michael looked at Mary Poppins. 4 each, she said. That's 12. 1 dozen. I'll make it a baker's dozen. Take 13. Miss Corey said cheerfully. So Jane and Michael chose 13 slabs of gingerbread, each with its gilt paper star. Their arms were piled up with delicious dark cakes. Michael could not resist nibbling the corner of one of them. Good? Squeaked Mrs. Corey. When she nodded, she'd picked up her skirts and did a few steps of the Highland Fling for pure pleasure. We watched videos of the Highland Fling before, if you remember, It was a dance where people were jumping up and down in those skirts. I lost my spot. Oh, hooray, hooray, splendid hooray, she cried in her shrill little voice. And then she came to a standstill and her face grew serious. But remember, I'm not giving them away. I must be paid. The price is 3 pence for each of you. Mary Poppins opened her purse and took out 3 penny bits. 3 3-penny bits. So you see those coins right there, 1, 2, 3, those gold coins, those are 3 penny bits. And that's how much they need to pay for 13 gingerbread cookies. Mary Poppins gave one to Jane and one to Michael. Now, said Mrs. Corey, stick them on my coat. That's where they all go. They looked closely at her long black coat. And sure enough, they found it was studded with 3 penny bits. As a coster's coat, is with pearl buttons. Come along, stick 'em on, repeated Mrs. Corey, rubbing her hands with pleasant expectation. You'll find they won't drop off. Okay, friends, now, this is where I get to tell you about something very, very interesting, okay? Now, the kids want to pay the money to Mrs. Corey for the gingerbread that they're buying, right? Miss Corey says, stick them on my jacket, my coat, my black coat. And when they take a closer look, they realize that her coat is actually covered in coins. Just like it says a coster's coat. Now, before I read this tonight, I didn't know what a coster's coat was. I learned today. Let me tell you, it's very interesting. It says a coster's coat with pearl buttons. Do you see these buttons here? Those buttons are pearl buttons. They are made from mother of pearl. And the best mother of pearl buttons in the world come from Japan, okay? Now, this is pretty strange and cool. Look at this picture here. Do you see this black jacket with the little metal circles on it? That is called a studded jacket. Let me type out that word studded for you. In case you ever see it again, you'll recognize it. A studded jacket. And a studded jacket is any kind of jacket that has little things all over it. Maybe they're little stars, or maybe they're little spikes, or maybe they're little circles, or maybe they're little like some sort of design, square, triangle, some sort of shape. But when you cover a jacket in lots of little things that way, it's called a studded jacket. Now look at that man in this picture with all of those. He's wearing the black clothes with the little white shapes on it. This man, now I hope you're all listening because this is very interesting. This man, he lived many years ago in London. Obviously he was a real person. He lived many years ago in London and he had an interesting idea. He decided to take many pearl buttons and sew them onto a coat, okay? Not just a few, many, many, many buttons. He sewed them in designs all over his clothes and he sewed them on jackets, his hat, his pants, even shoes, even shirts, okay? And he would wear all those pearl button covered clothes to events that were supposed to be helping people. So sometimes people have fundraisers. A fundraiser is an event where you want to raise money. You're trying to get money for some good reason and give it to people. Well, this man wanted to help them raise money. So he wanted to look interesting. He wanted to wear some cool clothes. And when people would come and see his really cool pearly clothes with the pearly buttons, they would give a little bit of money. And the money that they were raising was for hospitals, helping sick people, okay? Well, a newspaper wrote about him because people thought, wow, this guy is really interesting. He's doing something new. He put so many pearly buttons on his coat that he's doing something new. It's interesting. And they called him the Pearly King. the pearly king of his little town. Well, guess what? Other people saw what he was doing and they decided to do it too. And all over London, the districts of London, people decided to make pearly clothes, and they called themselves pearly kings and pearly queens. And it became a really, really, really popular thing, which means a lot of people wanted to do it, even kids and babies. If you were a pearly king and the woman that was your wife, she was a pearly queen, and then your kids, those were the pearly princesses, princes, pearly daughters and sons. People would, look at this. Look at that man wearing pants and a jacket and a hat covered in pearly buttons. This has got to be something you've never seen before, because I've never seen this before today. But these pearly people, we call them pearly. Actually, you know what they're called? They're called pearlies. That's what they call themselves. They say, we are the pearlies. And it's just an amazing thing. But they love to do this so much. They became so famous. They actually got to like meet the Queen in England and meet very important people. And people thought they were so cool for doing this new type of clothes and also helping people, because that was how it all started. Remember, that man was raising money to help people who were sick in the hospital. Okay, I'm going to show you a video of the pearlies. Okay, we're going to finish up tonight with 2 videos of some pearlies. Okay, so you can see them in action. This is like the television story about these pearlies. You're going to get to see them in their cool clothes. Sorry, it's just loading. Oh, yeah. I don't know what the problem is. Okay.
2000 was safely carried out.
Hear a person talking in a British accent.
Think of a Cockney, you think of the old Kent Road, most likely. And anyhow, what could be more Cockney than a London pearly? Here they are indeed on their way to the Costers Cathedral, the Church of St Mary Magdalene, for their Harvest Festival. This is the big event in the pearly calendar.
They have a party
Everybody was
every
there,
year where they wear their special clothes.
There's been some doubt as to who is the pearly king. There are 16 altogether, wearing between them 40,000 pearl buttons. That means 5½ hundredweight. So even if you're only a pretender to the pearly throne, you've quite enough weight on your shoulders. Holy Trinity Church, Hereford, was recently the scene of...
Isn't that amazing? Okay, now I have one more video. We are going to get to see some more pearlies before we finish up tonight. Okay, here we go.
Topping this week's personality parade, come in and meet the Matthews family, one of the last of the old pearly kings. We start at the young end of the family with granddaughter Linda. Still to come are the other grandchildren, Brenda and Peter.
See all those buttons?
Daughters Rose and Elsie, and then the pearly king and his queen, Bert Matthews and the missus. A queer story, that of the Pearlies. Few of Britain's traditional figures have excited more interest and received less study than they. For those sentimentalists find it hard to believe the real pearly king is rare, a relic of the past. Today, Bert Matthews in his button finery slips straight back into the 1860s, when street hawkers were so common that a housewife could buy everything she wanted without going beyond her front gate. Bert Matthews is a grandfather himself now, but his father would remember
all
the great
those
days
pearly
of
buttons.
the rabbit skin man, the perambulating potman with his mugs of beer, the muffin man, the drayman, and the cat's meat boys. Now all they can do is to keep an old tradition alive with their saucy cut clothes and their Albert Chevalier double talk. And now, wait for it, the Queen's Feather Titfer, a thing to be seen to be believed.
Big feather hat goes with the outfit. That's the pearly
It's still a bit of a
key.
shock even to the youngsters. And if their bonnets still have only a few buttons, their time will come when Grandma's titfer passes down the line.
Necklaces made of pearls and earrings made of pearls too. Oh look, I have pearls on right now,
The
look!
few Pearlies who are left hold court in Hampstead, but they're no longer kings of the fairground and the racecourses. When they dress up now, it's usually to go out collecting for charity. Once upon a time, the Pearly King was chosen by his fellow costers because he was the best scrapper or the hardest case amongst them. Later on, as Victorian respectability took over, the power of the Pearly King declined. First, he became the most respected of the Coster citizens, and now, well, he's not much more than a colourful memory. But it's a memory London will always keep alive.
Love this. Would you like to have a pearly outfit? Would you like to have a jacket with pearly buttons all over it? I would definitely. I wish I had a lot of pearly buttons that I could use right now and sew on my clothes. It would be a fun project. All right, friends, that's where we will stop for tonight, and I'll see you on Wednesday, okay? Thanks for coming. I hope you liked learning about the pearly buttons. Okay, I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.